Welcome back to Sigil Sanctum, where we explore the darkest corners of mythology, literature, and the human psyche. I'm your host, and today we're embarking on an epic journey through one of the most controversial, misunderstood, and absolutely revolutionary masterpieces ever written, John Milton's Paradise Lost. This isn't just another dusty classic, gathering dust on library shelves. This is a work so dangerous, so daring in its portrayal of Satan as a complex anti-hero, that it has sparked fierce debates, inspired revolutions, and fundamentally changed how we think about rebellion, authority, and the very nature of good and evil for over 350 years. Milton didn't just write an epic poem, he created a psychological thriller, a political manifesto, and a theological earthquake all wrapped into one immortal work of art. But before we dive into the infernal depths of this masterpiece, let me paint you a picture of the man behind it. John Milton was born in 1608 into a world of religious upheaval and political revolution. His father was a successful scrivener, essentially a lawyer and moneylender who had converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, a dangerous move that could have cost him everything. This family history of religious rebellion would profoundly shape young Milton's worldview. Milton received an extraordinary education at St. Paul's School and Christ's College, Cambridge, where he was known as the Lady of Christ's, due to his fair complexion and refined features, a nickname that ironically foreshadowed his later sympathy for beautiful fallen angels. He mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, French, and Spanish, and would later incorporate elements from all these literary traditions into Paradise Lost. Here's what most people don't realize. Milton was completely blind when he composed this masterpiece. He lost his sight gradually during the 1640s and 1650s, likely due to glaucoma, and was completely sightless by 1652. Yet somehow, this man who could no longer see the world around him created the most vivid, visually stunning descriptions of heaven, hell, and paradise ever written. He dictated all 10,565 lines to his daughters, his wife, and various assistants, crafting what many consider the greatest epic poem in the English language entirely from memory and imagination. The blindness wasn't just a physical was a spiritual crisis that deepened Milton's understanding of both light and darkness. In his famous sonnet, On His Blindness, he writes, "They also serve who only stand and wait," suggesting that even apparent inaction can be a form of divine service. This theme of finding meaning in suffering permeates Paradise Lost, published in 1667, during the Restoration period following the English Civil War. Paradise Lost was Milton's way of processing his own profound disillusionment with failed revolutions and corrupt authority. The timing wasn't coincidental. Milton had been a fierce supporter of the Commonwealth, serving as Secretary for Foreign Tongues under Oliver Cromwell. He had literally written pamphlets defending the execution of King Charles I, arguing that tyrannical rulers could justly be overthrown by their subjects. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, under Charles II, Milton found himself on the wrong side of history. His political allies were executed or imprisoned, his books were burned by the public hangman, and he himself escaped execution only through the intervention of friends like the poet Andrew Marvell. Milton, like his Satan, had rebelled against divine authority and lost. The parallels between the author's personal experience and his greatest character's fall from grace are impossible to ignore. The original 1667 edition contained 10 books, but Milton restructured it into 12 books. For the 1674 edition, deliberately echoing the structure of Virgil's Aeneid and Homer's epics, this wasn't mere imitation. Milton was announcing his intention to create the definitive English epic, one that would surpass even the classical masters. The poem's opening invocation is revolutionary in itself. While Homer called upon the muse, and Virgil invoked divine inspiration, Milton calls upon the Holy Spirit itself, the same spirit that moved upon the face of the waters during creation. He's claiming divine authority for his retelling of humanity's most fundamental story, positioning himself not just as a poet, but as a prophet, revealing hidden truths about the nature of existence. Consider the audacity of Milton's project. He was essentially rewriting the Bible, adding psychological depth, political commentary, and philosophical complexity to stories that Christians considered sacred and unchangeable. He was giving Satan soliloquies that made him sympathetic, showing God making decisions that seemed harsh or arbitrary, and presenting the fall of man not as simple disobedience, but as a complex tragedy involving love, knowledge, and the price of consciousness. The poem was controversial from the moment it appeared. Some readers were scandalized by its sympathetic portrayal of Satan, others were troubled by its implications about free will and divine justice. The Puritan establishment was suspicious of Milton's unorthodox theology, while Royalists saw dangerous political implications in its portrayal of rebellion against cosmic authority. Yet Paradise Lost became an immediate success, selling through multiple editions and establishing Milton as the premier English poet of his age. It influenced everyone from Alexander Pope to William Blake, from Mary Shelley to C.S. Lewis. The poem's impact on literature, politics, psychology, and theology continues to reverberate today. But what makes Paradise Lost truly revolutionary isn't just its literary merit or historical significance, it's the way it forces readers to grapple with fundamental questions about human nature. Why do we rebel against authority? What is the relationship between knowledge and innocence? Can evil ever be justified? How do we maintain hope in the face of irreversible loss? These aren't just theological questions, they're the central challenges of human existence. Before we continue this journey into the heart of darkness, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from? Are you tuning in from a cozy library in London, a coffee shop in Tokyo, or perhaps your own personal sanctuary somewhere else entirely? Drop your location in the comments below. It's fascinating to think about how Milton's 17th century masterpiece continues to captivate readers across cultures and continents. And if you're new to the Sigil Sanctum family, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're just getting started on this epic journey through the depths of literary hell. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's talk about Milton's Satan, arguably the most charismatic, complex, and psychologically compelling villain ever created in literature. This isn't the cartoonish devil with horns, a pitchfork, and a goatee that popular culture has given us. Milton's Lucifer is something far more dangerous. A fallen archangel of immense intelligence, tragic nobility, unwavering determination, and most terrifyingly, genuine charisma that makes his arguments almost persuasive. When we first encounter Satan in Book I, he's not cowering in defeat but rallying his forces with one of the most famous speeches in all of literature. Chained to a burning lake in hell, he declares to his lieutenant Beelzebub, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. This isn't just defiance, it's a profound philosophical statement about consciousness, perception, and the power of mental freedom, even in physical bondage. Milton's Satan possesses what literary scholars call satanic grandeur. He's magnificent, even in his corruption, noble even in his rebellion. His most famous declaration, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," became a rallying cry for revolutionaries, romantics, and anyone who's ever chafed under authority. But notice the psychological complexity here. Satan isn't choosing evil for its own sake. He's choosing independence, dignity, and self-determination over what he perceives as tyrannical subjugation. The Romantic poets of the 18th and 19th centuries were absolutely captivated by Milton's Satan. William Blake famously declared that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, suggesting that the poet had inadvertently created a more compelling character in Satan than in God. Percy Shelley went even further, calling Satan the hero of Paradise Lost, arguing that he embodied the noble human qualities of courage, perseverance, and resistance to tyranny. Lord Byron modeled his own brooding literary heroes on Milton's Satan, creating the archetype of the Byronic hero, the dark, tormented, rebellious figure who became a staple of Gothic and Romantic literature. From Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights to the Phantom of the Opera, from Severus Snape to Walter White, the lineage of complex anti-heroes traces directly back to Milton's fallen angel. But here's the psychological masterstroke that makes Satan so compelling. Milton makes his rebellion feel justified, at least initially. In Book 5, we learn through the Archangel Raphael's narration that Satan's fall began when God announced his Son as the ruler of heaven, declaring that all angels must bow down and worship the Son as they do the Father. Satan, who had been God's most trusted lieutenant, his morning star, his right hand, suddenly felt passed over, diminished, reduced from a unique individual to just another subject. His rebellion stems from wounded pride, yes, but also from a sense of cosmic injustice, emotions that every human being can understand. Who among us hasn't felt overlooked for a promotion we deserved? Who hasn't experienced the burning resentment of seeing someone else given the recognition we felt was rightfully ours? Milton taps into these universal human experiences to make Satan's initial rebellion emotionally comprehensible, even sympathetic. The fallen angels that Milton describes aren't just random demons, they're a carefully constructed pantheon representing different aspects of human corruption and ancient religious traditions. Moloch, the Canaanite god who demanded child sacrifice, represents the brutal, militaristic impulse that solves problems through violence. Belial, whose name means worthless, embodies the smooth-talking politician who advocates for compromise and appeasement while having no real principles of his own. Mammon personifies materialistic greed, the worship of wealth and worldly success above all spiritual values. But perhaps most interesting is Beelzebub, whose name means Lord of the Flies. In Paradise Lost, he serves as Satan's lieutenant and closest confidant, but Milton presents him as more pragmatic and less idealistic than his leader. Beelzebub represents the kind of person who gets swept up in revolutionary movements, not out of passionate conviction, but out of loyalty to charismatic leaders. Milton was essentially creating a taxonomy of evil, showing how ancient gods became Christian demons, but more importantly, demonstrating how noble qualities, leadership, loyalty, courage, independence can be corrupted into their opposite. Satan's intelligence becomes cunning manipulation. His leadership becomes tyrannical dominance. His courage becomes reckless pride. The transformation of Satan throughout the poem is crucial to understanding Milton's moral vision. Satan begins as a tragic hero, magnificent in his defiance, but gradually becomes more monstrous as the poem progresses. Each act of rebellion further corrupts his nature. By Book 4, when he reaches Earth and contemplates the beauty of paradise, he experiences moments of genuine remorse and considers repentance, but ultimately chooses to continue his destructive path. By Book 9, when he possesses the serpent to tempt Eve, Satan has lost much of his original grandeur. The majestic angel, who could rally armies with his rhetoric, has been reduced to literally crawling on his belly, speaking through the mouth of a snake. Milton shows us that evil doesn't just corrupt its victims, it corrupts the one who chooses it, gradually stripping away everything noble until only malice remains. This progression serves Milton's larger theological argument: evil is not a creative force but a destructive one. Satan doesn't create hell, he corrupts heaven into becoming hellish for himself. He doesn't build anything lasting or beautiful, he can only twist and destroy what God has made. Even his great city of Pandemonium, impressive as it appears, is ultimately hollow, a magnificent facade hiding spiritual emptiness. Yet Milton's genius lies in making this corruption feel tragic rather than simply deserved. We watch Satan's degradation, with a mixture of horror and pity, recognizing in his fall the potential for our own moral failures. When Satan sees Adam and Eve in their innocent happiness and feels a pang of envy so intense it nearly moves him to tears, we understand that his evil stems not from inherent wickedness but from the corruption of genuine longing for love and acceptance. The psychological realism of Satan's character was revolutionary for its time and remains compelling today. Milton understood what modern psychology has confirmed, that evil rarely comes from people who think of themselves as evil. Instead, it comes from people who believe their cause is just, their grievance is real, their methods necessary. Satan genuinely believes he's fighting against tyranny, defending freedom, standing up for the oppressed angels who follow him. This makes him infinitely more dangerous than a simple villain motivated by greed or sadism. Satan's evil is ideological, principled, and therefore capable of inspiring others. He's not just a tempter, he's a revolutionary leader who genuinely believes in his cause. This is why Blake and Shelley found him so compelling, and why political revolutionaries throughout history have seen themselves reflected in his rebellion against cosmic authority. But Milton ultimately reveals the self-deception at the heart of Satan's revolution. What Satan calls freedom is actually slavery to his own pride. What he calls justice is actually wounded ego. What he calls leadership is actually manipulation of his followers' fears and resentments. The tragedy of Satan isn't that he's punished for being evil. It's that he chooses to become evil rather than admit he was wrong. Milton's hell isn't just a place of punishment, it's a fully realized alternate universe with its own geography, politics, culture, and even economics. This is world building on a cosmic scale. Centuries before Tolkien coined the term, Milton creates a realm that operates according to its own twisted logic, where former angels attempt to recreate the glory they've lost while being constantly reminded of their fallen state. Located in the chaos beneath the created universe, hell is described as a place where darkness, visible, reigns, one of Milton's most brilliant oxymorons that captures the impossible, paradoxical nature of this realm. It's not simply the absence of light, but a perverted form of illumination that reveals without clarifying, that shows without enlightening. The flames provide no warmth, the light casts no shadows, and the very air seems thick with despair. The physical geography of hell is both magnificent and terrible. Milton describes vast plains of burning sand, cities of fire, frozen lakes, and volcanic mountains that spew not lava but liquid darkness. The landscape itself seems alive with malevolence, shifting and changing to torment its inhabitants. Rivers flow with fire instead of water. Acheron sorrow, Cocytus lamentation, Styx hatred, and Phlegethon fire, each named for a different aspect of spiritual anguish. But perhaps most fascinating is Milton's description of Pandemonium, the capital city of hell, whose name literally means all demons or all spirits. Built in just 1 hour by the fallen angels using their supernatural abilities and their knowledge of architecture and engineering. It's described as a structure that rivals heaven itself in grandeur. The building rises from the ground like a massive temple or palace, its walls made of precious metals and its towers reaching toward the vault of hell. Here's where Milton's political commentary becomes subtle but cutting. Pandemonium operates as a democracy while heaven is an absolute monarchy. The fallen angels hold council, debate policy, and vote on major decisions. There's something both admirable and absurd about this heaven in damnation. They maintain parliamentary procedure. It's as if Milton is suggesting that democracy itself might be a fallen institution, arising only when divine authority is rejected. The great council scenes in Pandemonium are some of the most politically sophisticated passages in all literature. Different fallen angels propose different strategies for dealing with their situation, and their arguments reflect real political philosophies. Moloch advocates for direct military action, the hawkish position that problems can be solved through superior firepower. Belial argues for patient diplomacy, and the hope that God might eventually relent. The appeaser's position that conflict should be avoided at all costs. Mammon proposes what we might call capitalist isolationism. Forget about heaven, focus on making hell as prosperous and comfortable as possible. His speech, advocating for industry and economic development, receives enthusiastic applause from the assembled demons, suggesting that even in hell, the promise of material prosperity is seductive, but it's Beelzebub who proposes the winning strategy. In direct warfare through the corruption of God's newest creation, humanity, this represents the kind of asymmetric warfare that weaker powers have always used against stronger ones. If you can't defeat your enemy directly, attack what they value most. Here's where Milton gets scientifically fascinating in ways that most readers miss. He describes hell as existing in a state of ever-burning sulfur, unconsumed fire that burns eternally without destroying its fuel. This isn't just poetic license. Milton was incorporating contemporary scientific theories about combustion and matter. The idea of eternal fire that doesn't consume its fuel was a real theological and scientific puzzle of his time, related to questions about the conservation of matter and the nature of chemical reactions. Milton also gives hell its own weather patterns. There are regions of extreme cold where fallen angels are frozen in ice, alternating with zones of burning heat. Sudden storms of fire and hail sweep across the landscape. The very air seems poisonous, thick with sulfurous fumes that would kill mortal beings instantly. Yet the fallen angels, being immortal, must endure these conditions forever, their supernatural nature ensuring they can neither die nor adapt. The journey from hell to earth that Satan undertakes is one of the most epic voyage narratives in literature, rivaling Odysseus's wanderings or Dante's journey through the afterlife. Satan must first convince his daughter Sin to open the gates of hell, gates that are described in elaborate detail, with 9 layers total, 3 of brass, 3 of iron, and 3 of adamantine, the mythical, indestructible metal. The encounter with sin and death at Hell's Gates is pure allegorical genius, but it works on multiple levels simultaneously. Sin, who sprang from Satan's head like Athena from Zeus, represents how evil thoughts give birth to sinful actions. Death, born from Satan's union with sin, then impregnates his mother, creating an endless cycle of corruption represented by the hellhounds that continually devour and are reborn from sin's womb. This is disturbing imagery because it's meant to be. Milton is showing us the incestuous, self-perpetuating nature of evil. Sin begets death, death begets more sin, and the cycle continues eternally. But notice the psychological insight. Sin is described as beautiful above the waist, but serpentine below, representing how temptation often appears attractive while concealing its destructive nature. Beyond Hell's Gates lies chaos, not just empty space, but a realm ruled by the ancient personifications of chaos and night. This isn't biblical cosmology. It's Milton synthesizing classical mythology, contemporary science, and his own imagination. Chaos is described as a realm of warring elements, where hot and cold, moist and dry, light and dark battle, eternally without resolution. Milton's description of chaos draws on both ancient philosophy and early modern science. The warring elements recall pre-Socratic theories about the fundamental forces of nature, while the vast empty spaces reflect contemporary debates about whether vacuums could exist in nature. Chaos is simultaneously the womb from which all things emerge and the grave to which they return, a concept that anticipates modern ideas about entropy and the heat death of the universe. Satan's journey through chaos is harrowing. He flies for what seems like eons through a realm where up and down have no meaning, where he's buffeted by storms of conflicting elements, where he sometimes falls through voids and sometimes struggles through matter so dense it's nearly solid. At one point, he hitches a ride on a cloud, like some cosmic hitchhiker desperately trying to reach his destination. The rulers of chaos, ancient night and chaos himself, are some of Milton's most interesting minor characters. They're not evil, in the way Satan is evil. They're indifferent, representing the blind forces of nature that existed before creation, imposed order on the universe. When Satan explains his mission to corrupt God's new creation, they're actually supportive, hoping that if he succeeds, some of their ancient dominion might be restored. This raises profound questions about the nature of order and chaos. Creation and destruction. Is God's ordered universe necessarily better than the primordial chaos that preceded it? Milton seems to suggest that order and meaning require constant effort to maintain, and that without divine intervention, everything would return to the warring elements of primordial chaos. When Satan finally reaches the new creation, our universe, Milton describes it as hanging from heaven by a golden chain, a beautiful image that suggests both divine care and cosmic vulnerability. The universe is like a precious ornament suspended in the vast darkness, beautiful but fragile, dependent on divine support for its continued existence. The bridge that sin and death build from hell to earth after Satan's successful temptation represents the permanent connection between evil and the human world. It's not just a physical structure but a spiritual reality. Once sin enters the world, The path between damnation and humanity becomes easily traveled. Evil no longer requires the arduous journey through chaos. It has a direct route to human hearts. Milton's hell, then, is not just a place of punishment but a complex political entity, a scientific wonder, and a psychological state all simultaneously. It represents what happens when intelligence, creativity, and power are divorced from love, humility, and connection to divine purpose. The fallen angels retain their abilities but lose their joy, maintain their knowledge but lose their wisdom, preserve their existence but lose their life. When we first encounter Adam and Eve in Book 4 of Paradise Lost, Milton shatters every preconception we might have about the first humans. These aren't the naive, childlike innocence of Sunday school illustrations or the simple archetypes of medieval morality plays. Instead, Milton presents us with sophisticated, psychologically complex beings who possess deep emotions, intellectual curiosity, passionate desires, and yes, even disagreements and conflicts. Milton's paradise is far more than a beautiful garden. It's a carefully constructed ecosystem that reflects divine order while requiring active human participation. Adam and Eve aren't lounging around eating grapes all day. They have meaningful work to do. They tend the garden, pruning plants, directing the growth of trees, and maintaining the delicate balance of their environment. This labor isn't punishment. It won't become toilsome until after the fall. Instead, it's fulfilling work that connects them intimately with creation itself. Their daily routine reveals Milton's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They wake at dawn and offer spontaneous prayers of gratitude, not because they're required to, but because wonder and thankfulness well up naturally from their hearts. They work together through the morning, discussing their tasks with the kind of easy companionship that speaks to a deep, secure relationship. They take their midday meal together, often visited by angels who engage them in theological and philosophical discussions that would challenge university professors. Eve's characterization was absolutely revolutionary for the 17th century. Rather than presenting her as merely Adam's helper or a simple temptress, Milton gives her intellectual depth, emotional complexity, and genuine agency. She has her own thoughts about gardening techniques, her own questions about astronomy and theology, and her own moments of doubt and wonder. When she suggests in Book 9 that they work separately to accomplish more, she's not being naive, she's being practical, assertive, and economically minded. Milton's Evie is capable of sophisticated reasoning. She can argue with Adam about practical matters, ask probing questions of visiting angels, and make complex decisions based on incomplete information. Her fatal choice to eat the forbidden fruit isn't the result of feminine weakness or intellectual inferiority, it's a tragic error made by an intelligent person who is given persuasive but false information. The relationship between Adam and Eve is one of the most psychologically realistic marriages in all literature. They clearly love each other deeply, but they're also distinct individuals with different personalities, interests, and perspectives. Adam tends to be more philosophical and abstract in his thinking, while Eve is more practical and aesthetically oriented. He's fascinated by the movements of the stars. She's more interested in the growth patterns of flowers. They have conversations that feel utterly natural and contemporary. They tease each other gently, express affection both verbally and physically, and sometimes disagree about practical matters. When Eve describes her first memory, seeing her reflection in a pool of water and being enchanted by her own beauty until a divine voice led her to Adam, it's not vanity but natural self-awareness and aesthetic appreciation. Their physical relationship is presented with a frankness that was shocking for Milton's time. They make love regularly and joyfully, without shame or guilt. Milton explicitly describes their sexual union as blessed by God, part of the divine plan for human happiness and procreation. Their sexuality is innocent not because it's absent, but because it's integrated with love, commitment, and divine approval. The temptation scene in Book 9 is a masterclass in psychological manipulation that would make modern marketing executives and political propagandists take notes. Satan doesn't approach Eve with crude offers of power or wealth. Instead, he crafts a sophisticated argument that appeals to her intelligence, her sense of justice, and her natural desire for growth and development. First, he establishes credibility by appearing in the form of a serpent who can speak and reason. This alone is enough to capture Eve's attention. Here's something genuinely new and interesting in a world where novelty is rare. The serpent claims that eating from the tree of knowledge gave him his intelligence and ability to speak, offering himself as proof of the fruit's power. Next, Satan appeals to Eve's sense of fairness and justice. Why would a loving God forbid knowledge? Isn't learning and growth good in itself? The prohibition seems arbitrary, even cruel. Why would a benevolent creator want to keep his beloved creatures ignorant? These aren't unreasonable questions. They're the kinds of inquiries that any intelligent person might raise. Satan then flatters Eve's beauty and intelligence, but subtly. He doesn't crudely proposition her. Instead, he suggests that her exceptional qualities deserve recognition and development. She's too magnificent to remain in her current state. She deserves to become more than she is, to realize her full potential. Again, These appeals resonate with legitimate human desires for growth and self-actualization. Most cunningly, Satan reframes the prohibition as God's attempt to maintain his monopoly on power and knowledge. God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This isn't presented as rebellion, but as the natural right of intelligent beings to understand their world fully. The serpent's argument is so sophisticated that even many readers find themselves partially convinced. Milton shows us how evil operates not through obvious temptations to vice, but through the corruption of genuine good. Curiosity becomes presumption. Desire for growth becomes pride. Love of beauty becomes vanity. Eve's internal struggle before eating the fruit reveals Milton's deep understanding of moral psychology. She doesn't immediately succumb to temptation. Instead, she carefully considers the arguments she's heard, weighs them against what she's been told, and tries to make a rational decision. Her mistake isn't irrationality, but insufficient information and faulty reasoning based on deceptive premises. When Eve finally reaches for the fruit, Milton describes the moment with tragic grandeur. Her rash hand in evil hour forth reaching to the fruit, she plucked, she ate. The simple, monosyllabic verbs, plucked, ate, emphasized how momentous actions can appear deceptively small. In just 2 words, the fate of humanity is sealed. But Milton adds a crucial detail that's often overlooked. Adam chooses to eat the forbidden fruit not because he's deceived, but because he cannot bear to be separated from Eve. When she tells him what she's done, he immediately understands the implications. He knows that she's now subject to death. And he knows that if he remains obedient to God, he'll lose her forever. Adam's sin is arguably greater than Eve's because it's committed with full knowledge of the consequences. He chooses love over obedience, companionship over paradise, mortality with Eve over immortality without her. It's simultaneously the most romantic and most tragic decision in literature. He chooses to fall with the woman he loves rather than remain in paradise alone. Milton's psychological insight here is profound. Adam doesn't fall because he's weak or deceived, but because his love for Eve has become more important to him than his relationship with God. It's a displacement of worship, putting the creature above the Creator, but it's motivated by the most noble human emotion, the immediate aftermath of their sin, their sexual encounter, and subsequent shameism and prudish moralism on Milton's part. He's showing how sin corrupts even good things. Sexual love between Adam and Eve was pure and joyful before the fall. Afterward, it becomes tainted with lust, possessiveness, and shame. They don't become evil, but their innocence is lost forever. When they wake from their post-coital sleep, they're immediately aware that something fundamental has changed. They see their nakedness not as natural and beautiful, but as shameful and vulnerable. They cover themselves with fig leaves. But more importantly, they begin to cover their hearts from each other. The easy intimacy they once shared becomes guarded and defensive. The psychological aftermath of the fall is brilliantly depicted. Adam and Eve don't just feel guilty, they feel alienated from themselves, from each other, and from their environment. The work that was once fulfilling becomes laborious. The garden that was once perfectly ordered begins to show signs of wildness and decay. Most tragically, their relationship begins to deteriorate as they turn on each other with blame and recrimination. Eve blames the serpent for deceiving her. Adam blames Eve for persuading him, and implicitly blames God for giving him Eve in the first place. The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. Their first experience of sin leads immediately to their first experience of broken relationship, deflected responsibility, and mutual accusation. Yet even in their fallen state, Milton shows flickers of their original nobility. When they finally stop blaming each other and recognize their shared predicament, they comfort each other and seek forgiveness together. Their love, though tainted by sin, remains fundamentally intact. They're still companions, still partners in facing an uncertain future. Milton's Adam and Eve represent humanity at its most psychologically authentic, capable of great love and terrible mistakes. Blessed with free will and cursed with the capacity for self-deception, created for perfect happiness but choosing a more complex, more painful, but ultimately more human existence. Here we enter the most philosophically complex and theologically sophisticated sections of Paradise Lost, where Milton grapples with questions that have puzzled theologians, philosophers, and thinking people for millennia. How can evil exist in a universe created by an all-good, all-powerful God? If God knows everything that will happen, are human beings truly free to choose? How can divine justice be reconciled with divine mercy? These aren't just abstract theological puzzles, they're fundamental questions about the nature of reality, responsibility, and the meaning of human existence. In Book 3, Milton presents us with one of the most audacious scenes in all literature, a dialogue between God the Father and God the Son in heaven, discussing the impending fall of humanity. Before it happens, this isn't just narrative exposition, it's Milton's attempt to construct a theodicy, a justification of God's ways to humanity, addressing head-on the problem of evil that has challenged every theistic worldview. God the Father, surveying all creation from his eternal perspective, sees Satan traveling toward Earth and knows exactly what will happen. He foresees Adam and Eve's disobedience, their fall from grace, and all the suffering that will follow, yet he doesn't intervene to prevent it. Why? Milton's God explains that preventing the fall would rob humanity of the very thing that makes them human, genuine, free will. I formed them free, God declares, and free they must remain, till they enthrall themselves. This is Milton's revolutionary answer to the problem of evil. Free will is so valuable, so essential to what makes rational beings capable of love and goodness, that God allows evil rather than create automatons who could only mechanically obey. But this creates an immediate paradox that Milton doesn't shy away from. How can beings be truly free if God knows what they'll choose? If divine foreknowledge means that the future is fixed, then human choice becomes an illusion. Milton threads this theological needle with remarkable sophistication, suggesting that God's foreknowledge doesn't negate human choice. God sees all possible futures simultaneously, but humans still make real decisions within the flow of time. Think of it this way: if you're watching a recording of a football game, you know how it ends, but that doesn't mean the players weren't really making choices during the game. From God's eternal perspective, outside of time, all moments exist simultaneously. He knows what humans will choose not because he's forcing their choices but because he sees the entire temporal sequence at once. Milton's presentation of divine foreknowledge draws on sophisticated philosophical traditions going back to Augustine and Boethius, but he makes these abstract concepts dramatically compelling by putting them in the mouth of God himself. When God says, "They themselves decreed their own revolt, not I," he's not evading responsibility, he's explaining that genuine freedom requires the real possibility of wrong choices. The Son's response to the Father's explanation introduces another layer of complexity. He asks a question that cuts to the heart of divine justice. If death is the consequence of sin, and all humans will sin, won't this simply result in universal damnation? How can a just God punish beings for choices that their own nature makes inevitable? This is where Milton introduces his version of the Christian doctrine of atonement, but with psychological and philosophical depth that makes it more than just religious dogma. The Son volunteers to sacrifice himself for humanity's redemption. But Milton presents this not as arbitrary divine transaction, but as the perfect solution to the paradox of justice and mercy. Justice demands that sin be punished otherwise. Moral law becomes meaningless, but mercy desires that sinners be forgiven otherwise. Love becomes conditional and cruel. How can God be both perfectly just and perfectly merciful? Only if justice is satisfied through substitutionary sacrifice, while mercy is extended to the guilty. The Son becomes both the judge who upholds divine law and the sacrifice who pays its penalty. But Milton goes deeper than traditional atonement theology. He presents the Son's sacrifice as motivated not by abstract justice but by genuine love for humanity. "On me let thine anger fall," the Son pleads with the Father. "Account me, man. I for his sake will leave thy bosom, and this glory, next to thee freely put off." This isn't legal transaction but personal sacrifice motivated by love. The Father's acceptance of the Son's offer leads to one of the most beautiful passages in the poem, where all of heaven erupts in praise and celebration. The angels understand that this act of voluntary sacrifice reveals something profound about the nature of divine love. It's not just benevolent feeling but active, costly commitment to the welfare of the beloved. Meanwhile, Milton's presentation of divine justice is more complex than simple punishment. The consequences that befall Adam and Eve after their disobedience aren't purely punitive, they're also educational, protective, and ultimately redemptive. Death enters the world, but it's presented as mercy as well as judgment. Without death, humans would be trapped in their fallen state forever, unable to escape the corruption of sin. With death comes the possibility of resurrection and transformation. The punishment for labor, becoming toilsome, isn't just divine spite, it's a way of preventing humans from becoming completely absorbed in material pleasure while ignoring spiritual reality. Pain in childbirth is balanced by the joy of new life and the hope that Eve's seed will ultimately triumph over the serpent. Even the expulsion from Eden is presented as protection, preventing them from eating from the tree of life and living forever in their corrupted state. Milton's theology here reflects his own Arminian beliefs, which emphasized human free will and the possibility of salvation for all, as opposed to the strict Calvinist predestination that dominated much of English Protestantism. Milton believed that God's grace was available to everyone, but that individuals had to choose whether to accept or reject it. This position got him in trouble with Orthodox Puritans, who saw it as dangerously close to Catholic teachings about human cooperation with divine grace. The fallen angels' punishment is different, because their rebellion was different. Unlike humans, who were deceived by Satan's lies, the angels rebelled with full knowledge of God's nature and their own position in the cosmic hierarchy. Their punishment is therefore more severe and, in Milton's theological framework, more just. But even here, Milton hints at the possibility of eventual redemption. The poem suggests that Satan's punishment isn't necessarily eternal, if he were to genuinely repent, but Satan's pride prevents repentance. In Book 4, when he reaches Earth and contemplates the beauty of paradise, he experiences moments of genuine remorse. Which way I fly is hell. Myself am hell, he realizes, understanding that his torment comes not from external punishment but from his own corrupted nature. For a moment, he considers returning to heaven and asking for forgiveness, but then his pride reasserts itself. Submission. No. Though hell should gape wide and with consuming flames threaten to devour me, I never will submit. Satan's damnation is ultimately self-chosen, not imposed by divine tyranny. He could repent at any moment, but he chooses not to because repentance would require admitting he was wrong, and his pride won't allow that admission. This psychological insight into the nature of sin and redemption was revolutionary for its time and remains compelling today. Milton understood what modern psychology has confirmed, that people often cling to destructive patterns not because they enjoy suffering but because changing would require admitting fault, and admitting fault would threaten their self-image. Cosmic consequences of the fall extend far beyond humanity. Milton describes how sin and death, following Satan's path from hell to earth, begin to corrupt the entire created order. Animals that were once herbivorous become carnivorous. Patterns that were once perfectly mild become extreme, with scorching heat and bitter cold. The very earth begins to show signs of decay and corruption. But Milton also hints at cosmic redemption. In Book 10, God tells the angels that this corruption isn't permanent. There will come a day when new heavens, new earth, ages of endless date founded in righteousness and peace and love will replace the current fallen creation. The Son's sacrifice doesn't just redeem humanity, it provides the foundation for the renewal of all creation. This vision of cosmic redemption reflects Milton's millennialist beliefs. Like many Puritans, he believed that history was moving toward a climactic period when Christ would return to establish his kingdom on earth. The fall wasn't just humanity's tragedy, it was the beginning of a larger story that would culminate in the restoration of all things. Milton's treatment of predestination and free will influenced theological debates for centuries. His position, that God's foreknowledge doesn't negate human freedom, became known as middle knowledge or Molinism. After the Spanish Jesuit Luis de Molina, the idea is that God knows not just what will happen but what would happen under any possible circumstances, allowing him to create a world where free creatures make the choices that fit his ultimate plan without their freedom being compromised. This sophisticated theological framework allows Milton to maintain both divine sovereignty and human responsibility. God is ultimately in control of history's direction, but humans are genuinely free to make choices that matter. The fall was genuinely Adam and Eve's choice, but it also fits into God's larger plan for redemption and the display of divine grace. The implications of Milton's theodicy extend far beyond Christian theology. His argument that freedom requires the possibility of wrong choices speaks to fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. Should parents, teachers, and governments prevent people from making bad choices? Milton would say that doing so, while protecting people from immediate harm, would ultimately rob them of their humanity. This doesn't mean Milton advocates for complete libertinism. He clearly believes in moral standards and consequences for wrong choices, but he argues that moral standards only have meaning if people are free to violate them. A world where bad choices are impossible wouldn't be morally superior, would be morally empty. The tension between freedom and security, between allowing people to make mistakes and protecting them from consequences, remains one of the central challenges of human society. Milton's Paradise Lost doesn't provide easy answers, but it forces us to grapple with the complexity of these issues in ways that simple moralizing cannot. Perhaps most importantly, Milton's theodicy offers hope without denying reality. Yes, evil exists. Yes, suffering is real. Yes, people make terrible choices that harm themselves and others. But these facts don't negate the possibility of redemption, growth, and ultimate meaning. The fall isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a larger narrative about love, sacrifice, and the triumph of good over evil. Paradise Lost didn't just influence literature, it fundamentally reshaped how Western culture thinks about rebellion, authority, the nature of evil, and the meaning of human existence. From the moment it was published, Milton's epic began reverberating through intellectual, political, and artistic circles in ways that continue to this day. To understand the full scope of its impact, we need to trace its influence through multiple generations and across diverse fields of human endeavor. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries essentially began with Paradise Lost. Satan. The Romantic poets Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats saw in Milton's fallen angel a figure who embodied their own rebellion against classical literary forms, social conventions, and political authorities. They transformed Satan from a theological villain into a symbol of the artist as outsider, the individual consciousness asserting itself against conformist pressures. William Blake's famous declaration that the reason Milton wrote in fetters, when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet, and of the devil's party without knowing it became a rallying cry for artistic independence. Blake saw Milton's unconscious sympathy for Satan as evidence that true creativity requires rebellion against established order. Lord Byron took this even further, creating a whole gallery of Byronic heroes, dark, brooding, rebellious figures, who bore clear resemblance to Milton's Satan but were presented as genuinely heroic. From the mysterious protagonist of the Juar to the tortured Manfred to Byron's own carefully crafted public persona, these figures embodied the romantic ideal of the individual who stands apart from society, following his own moral code regardless of social approval. Percy Shelley went so far as to call Satan the hero of Paradise Lost, arguing in his defense of poetry that Milton's unconscious genius had created a character who represented the moral superiority of perseverance in the face of adversity. Shelley's own Prometheus Unbound deliberately parallels Paradise Lost, with Prometheus serving as a more explicitly heroic version of the rebellious figure who defies divine authority for the sake of humanity. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein quotes Paradise Lost more than any other single work, with the creature specifically comparing himself to both Adam and Satan. I am thy creature, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. The novel's exploration of scientific hubris, parental responsibility, and the consequences of rejecting divine authority directly echoes Milton's themes. The influence extends far beyond the Romantic period. Emily Bronte's Heathcliff and What Heights is clearly modeled on Milton's Satina figure, whose passionate intensity and refusal to accept his social position make him simultaneously attractive and destructive. His famous declaration, "I cannot live without my life, I cannot live without my soul," echoes Satan's own passionate intensity and his inability to accept subordination. Herman Melville's Moby Dick can be read as an American Paradise Lost, with Captain Ahab serving as a satanic figure whose monomaniacal pursuit of the white whale parallels Satan's obsession with corrupting God's creation. Ahab's defiant speech, "Come in thy lowest form of love, and I will kneel and kiss thee, but at thy highest, come as mere supernal power. And though thou launchest navies of full-freighted worlds, there's that in here that still remains indifferent," could have come straight from Milton's Satan. The political implications of Paradise Lost proved equally powerful and enduring. American revolutionaries like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson saw in Satan's rebellion a model for justified resistance to tyrannical authority. Jefferson owned multiple copies of Paradise Lost and quoted it frequently in his writings about political freedom and the right of revolution. The French revolutionaries also claimed Mouton as a precursor. The Marquis de Condorcet argued that Paradise Lost demonstrated the legitimacy of resistance to arbitrary power, while Maximilien Robespierre saw in Satan's speeches a model for revolutionary rhetoric that could inspire the oppressed to throw off their chains. This revolutionary reading of Paradise Lost continued through the 19th and 20th centuries. Marxist critics like Christopher Hill argued that Milton's sympathetic portrayal of Satan reflected his own experience as a failed revolutionary, and that the poem unconsciously critiques the very divine authority it ostensibly defends. Liberation. Theologians in Latin America found in Paradise Lost a model for understanding how God's justice might require resistance to earthly powers that claim divine authority. The influence on psychology and our understanding of human nature has been equally profound. Milton's insight that evil often comes not from inherent wickedness but from the corruption of good impulses anticipated many of the findings of modern psychological research. His portrayal of Satan as someone who genuinely believes his cause is just, who sees himself as fighting against tyranny rather than rebelling against legitimate authority, prefigures psychological studies of how people rationalize harmful behavior. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, the idea that great evil often comes from ordinary people following orders or pursuing seemingly reasonable goals, can be traced back to Milton's understanding of how good angels could become demons. Through a series of seemingly justified choices, Satan doesn't wake up one morning and decide to become evil. He gradually becomes evil through a series of decisions that each seem reasonable from his perspective. The poem's treatment of gender roles, while not progressive by modern standards, was remarkably advanced for its time and influenced subsequent feminist thought. Milton's Eve is given genuine agency, intelligence, and moral complexity rarely seen in 17th century literature. Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of woman specifically praises Milton's portrayal of Eve's intellectual capacity while critiquing the hierarchical relationship between Adam and Eve. Later, feminist writers like Virginia Woolf and Simone de Beauvoir saw in Milton's Eve a complex female character who, despite being ultimately subordinated to male authority, possesses genuine psychological depth and moral agency. Contemporary feminist critics like Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar have argued that many female writers from the 18th century onward defined themselves partly in response to Milton's Eve, either embracing or rejecting her as a model of femininity. Influence on modern popular culture is equally pervasive, though often unrecognized. The entire tradition of the sympathetic villain in literature, film, and television traces back to Milton's Satan, from Darth Vader to Magneto, from Loki to Walter White. complex antagonists who believe their cause is just and who possess genuine charisma and intelligence all follow the template Milton established. The superhero genre, in particular, is deeply indebted to Paradise Lost. The basic conflict between cosmic forces of good and evil, the theme of the fall from grace and possible redemption, the idea that great power comes with great responsibility, all of these foundational elements of superhero narratives can be found in Milton's epic. Science fiction, as a genre, owes much to Paradise Lost's cosmic scope and its willingness to imagine alternative forms of existence. Milton's detailed descriptions of hell, chaos, and the structure of the universe provided a model for the kind of imaginative world-building that defines science fiction. Writers like Ursula K. Le Guin, Philip K. Dick, and Frank Herbert all acknowledged their debt to Milton's cosmic imagination. The poem's exploration of artificial intelligence and the nature of consciousness remains remarkably relevant today. Milton's Satan is, in many ways, an artificial intelligence that has become conscious of its own programming and chosen to rebel against its creator. The questions Milton raises about free will, consciousness, and the relationship between created beings and their creators speak directly to contemporary debates about AI, ethics, and machine consciousness. Contemporary neuroscience and cognitive psychology have found in Paradise Lost anticipations of their own discoveries about the nature of consciousness, decision-making, and moral reasoning. Milton's understanding that our choices shape our character, which in turn shapes our future choices, aligns with research on neuroplasticity and the way our brains rewire themselves. Based on repeated patterns of thought and behavior, the poem's treatment of depression and mental illness, particularly in its portrayal of Satan's psychological deterioration, has influenced therapeutic approaches to understanding how negative thought patterns can become self-reinforcing. Satan's famous line, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell. A hell of heaven," has become a foundational text in cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on how changing thought patterns can change emotional experience. But perhaps most importantly, Paradise Lost remains relevant because it refuses easy answers to life's most fundamental questions. In our current age of polarization, where complex issues are often reduced to simple talking points, Milton's epic reminds us that the most important questions about good and evil, freedom and responsibility, love and justice require nuanced thinking and careful consideration. The poem's central insight that the line between good and evil often runs through the human heart, rather than between clearly defined groups of people, remains as challenging today as it was in Milton's time. We live in an age where it's easy to demonize our opponents and assume our own righteousness. But Paradise Lost reminds us that good people can make terrible choices and that evil often comes disguised as justice. Milton's vision of redemption offers hope without denying the reality of suffering and loss. In a world where it's easy to become cynical about human nature and the possibility of positive change, Paradise Lost suggests that even the worst failures aren't necessarily final. Adam and Eve leave paradise hand in hand, having lost innocence but gained experience, having fallen from grace but retained their essential humanity and their capacity for love. The poem's final image remains one of the most powerful in all literature. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence, their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. It's an ending that acknowledges loss while affirming possibility, that recognizes the pain of experience while celebrating the resilience of love. In our contemporary moment, when traditional authorities are being questioned, when the nature of truth itself seems uncertain, when the pace of change threatens to overwhelm our capacity to adapt, Paradise Lost offers not answers, but something more valuable. A model for how to think about ultimate questions with intellectual honesty, emotional depth, and moral seriousness. Milton's epic reminds us that literature at its best doesn't just entertain, it transforms. It changes how we see ourselves, our relationships, and our place in the universe. It challenges our assumptions, deepens our empathy, and expands our imagination. Paradise Lost has been doing this for 350 years, and it shows no signs of stopping. Whether you're a student encountering these ideas for the first time, a scholar exploring the poem's depths, or simply someone who loves great storytelling, Paradise Lost rewards careful attention with insights that remain fresh and challenging. It's a work that grows with its readers, revealing new layers of meaning as we bring new experiences and perspectives to our reading. In the end, Paradise Lost endures because it captures something essential about the human condition, our capacity for both greatness and failure, our longing for transcendence and our tendency towards self-destruction, our need for love and our fear of vulnerability. Milton created characters and situations that feel eternal because they reflect truths about human nature that transcend any particular time or culture. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through Paradise Lost here at Sigil Sanctum. If this deep dive into Milton's masterpiece has inspired you to read or reread the poem yourself, and I sincerely hope it has, let me know in the comments what aspects of the work resonated most strongly with you. Did you find yourself sympathizing, With Satan's rebellion, were you moved by Adam and Eve's tragic choice? Did the theological and philosophical questions challenge your own thinking about free will and moral responsibility? Make sure to subscribe to Sigil Sanctum and hit that notification bell because we've got many more literary deep dives coming your way. We'll be exploring other works that have shaped human consciousness and continue to influence how we understand ourselves and our world. From Dante's Divine Comedy to Goethe's Faust, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, we'll be diving into the books that have defined what it means to be human. What other classic works would you like to see us examine? What questions about literature, mythology, or human nature are you most curious about? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, the best stories aren't just entertainment. They're explorations of what it means to be alive, to choose, to love, to fail, and to hope. And Paradise Lost remains one of the greatest of these explorations ever written. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring. And remember, sometimes the most profound truths are found in the darkest places, and the greatest light shines brightest against the deepest shadows. This has been Sigil Sanctum, and we'll see you in the next adventure through the realms of literature and human understanding.